Hello everyone, welcome to the first lecture of this course on Sociology of Media and Communication. So, today is going to be an introductory lecture which is going to be setting the foundation for not just this unit which is titled Introduction to Media and Communication, but also for the course overall. So, when I have proposed this course, I am calling it Sociology of Media and Communication, and this unit is called Introduction to Media and Communication. So, to begin with, I want to first make a distinction between communication and media. So, in that context, let us first talk a little bit about communication and what does it mean. So, going through the sociological literature on communication, one can find that communication is an age-old concept, and what is also interesting to find is that it has existed since human society has existed. So, the nature of communication varies according to societal types and the kind of societies that have evolved over time, but there has always been some sort of communication or the other. So, when we think about communication, the first thing to understand is that it has a huge history. There is a historical evolution of the process of communication, and of course, its nature, and then how this has changed with time and developments. So, most of you as young learners would be familiar with mediatized technologies, digital technologies, but communication is not only about media. It is also about other forms of communication. So, it is in this context that one should make this distinction between communication and media, because communication is a much broader concept within which one can actually understand how media operates. So, when we think about media, communication is a huge least significant characteristic of media, right. So, it means that to become something which is mediatized or what would be called media, it requires a certain type of communication. Now, when we are thinking about communication, what does communication means, right? So, it actually is primarily dialogue, interaction or encounters between at least two parties. So, to communicate effectively, one needs a communicator and an audience or the recipients. For instance, in this case, I am the communicator, I am the one talking, communicating, with this understanding that you will understand and receive what I am saying. So, when we are thinking about systems of communication, they are rooted in cultural patterns. So, culture plays a huge role when we are thinking about communication. Let me briefly explain how culture is important to communication. So, for instance, there could be several cultures where the wink of the eye has specific meanings. Now, social anthropologist Clifford Geertz, popularly known for coining the term thick description and writing about ethnography and writing about cultures, interpretation of cultures, he argues that the wink in Balinese society has specific meanings which could be understood by people who are familiar with the social context. So, if you think about it, bodily gestures, hand gestures, ideas of how you may want to communicate with another being, they all have meanings, and these are cultural meanings. For instance, all of you will be familiar with the usage of emojis on platforms like WhatsApp. So, what do these emojis mean, right? That is a specific form of communication. So, this communication is rooted in the cultural patterns, the cognitive patterns, and the way that meaning is made out of those gestures. We also should keep in mind that when we are thinking about communication, it is actually something which also exists in a non-mediatized world. So, for instance, if we think about classrooms that have existed historically, unlike this one in which the digital and the technological do not exist, you will see that there is communication, but there may not be any use of technology or media. For instance, how traditional schooling as well as higher education took place is that the teacher and the student would directly communicate with each other. So, what I am trying to suggest is that communication is a much broader and longer kind of concept that has historically existed, with media being a relatively newer intervention, but there is an intricate relationship between the two, especially in the present context where media is taking on different communicative aspects and building on them. So, let us now talk a little bit about the types of communication. So, what are the types of communication that exist? So, if we think about these types, you could very easily figure out that there could be oral communication, there could be written communication, there could be primarily symbols, cave paintings, storytelling, theatre, drama, etc. So, if we go to the early years of communication, these on your screen are primarily some very early modes of communication. For instance, India has a rich history of oral traditions. What do I mean by oral traditions? Oral traditions are verbal, spoken words. So, for instance, many communities will have songs which are folk songs. In Assam, for instance, we have a particular kind of folk song which is called the Biyanam, or kinds of different music, theatre which are orally performed. They may not have the written scripts attached to them, but people communicated effectively through those folk traditions. Now, in the modern context, the focus has been on written forms of communication until recently, when the digital has challenged the written mode of communication to also incorporate more audiovisual content into this ambit of communication. But before the written word sort of became the mainstream form of communication, these oral traditions have dominated the discussion. So, in the Indian context, there are several people like Mackie Marriott and Milton Singer who have talked about little tradition and great tradition, focusing on the differences between what people in lower caste and classes and marginalized communities would do as little tradition, which would be primarily folk songs and connected to their social conditions, whereas the great tradition would be forms of communication and traditions which had more written and preserved kind of scripts. Now, when we are thinking about communication, apart from these oral traditions which India has a very rich history of, there also exist symbols and cave paintings. Interestingly, we also have something like sculptures. So, many of our ancient monuments, for instance, are known for their sculptural work, for their stone work, etc. In Assam as well, which is the region that I am currently living in, one can find a rich history of what would be called Hilalipi, which is primarily writing on stones, right. Hil means stone in Assamese. So, what we find is different forms of communication. The role of storytelling as a form of communication is particularly interesting because we have had great traditions of storytellers since early times in the Indian context. So, for instance, many of you may have heard of the Sutradhar, who is seen as a key part of drama or theatre, particularly in the classical Sanskritic traditions, who basically performs the role of communicating the transitions between scenes when such kind of drama is taking place, communicating with the audience, making them familiar with what is going on. Now, when we are thinking about this role of the Sutradhar in theatre, let me also very quickly state how drama and theatre are some of the oldest forms of communication in the social world. So, India particularly has had this rich tradition of theatre, which can be traced back to what would be called the Gaya Nataka and classical theatre. Which took a very Sanskritic form, and from Sanskritic theatre we had the emergence of folk theatre in let us say 11th century onwards, and these dates and timelines could vary considering your regional diversity, and then we had modern forms of theatre also emerging. So, interestingly, when one looks at the emergence of theatre, for instance, as a form of communication, Victor Turner traces it back to rituals, or what he would suggest as the social power of rituals. So, Turner suggests that when people who lived in ancient times faced difficulties related to nature, for instance, those of drought, or less rainfall or excess rainfall, they prayed to their gods, and this praying took the form of a theatrical performance, because it also became collective, and it meant people coming together and communicating with the highest deity that they would consider, who would be able to solve their issue. That social performance of this ritual is seen as the early origins of what is called theatre or drama. Essentially, very clearly underlining how ancient this history of communication is, that we cannot think about communication without thinking about this huge history that we have right in front of us. Now, from moving to print era, from what we would see these early communication forms, is a giant leap, primarily because the print era consolidated the written word. So, before this, when the written mode was used in communication, it was not consolidated in the way that the printing press and the industry was able to do so, primarily because what we have, the manuscripts which are written with barks of trees or other kinds of organic material, their preservation and circulation is not like the printing press. Because the printing press meant the introduction of technology and machine, it meant that how we then think about communication also changed. Let me explore a little bit in terms of why does this change happen. So, when we think about the printing press and its invention, it is seen as one of the greatest inventions in modern history, and it changes the way that we understand literacy. So, before the printing press, the ability and possibility of reading and writing were also seen as privileged tasks. So, very recently this discourse on artificial intelligence is also mirrored in discussions on reading and writing. And one of the articles that I was reading on AI mentioned that reading and writing are relatively very new cultural traditions in human society, which means that the entry of artificial intelligence could actually threaten these processes, because they are not in that sense very biologically connected to human functioning of the body. What this means is that, like I have suggested and showed so far, communication was not only about reading and writing, isn't it? Especially writing. It was actually about other ways of getting your point through. It could be in multiple forms. It only changed with the invention of the printing press and how literacy became mass in nature. What it means is that because of the printing press and how the printing press was able to take the written word to every nook and corner of society, the literacy rates in general increased, right. This era is also connected to the rise of the newspapers and books, because you had large number of printed material which were read across the world. This is connected to what we would soon be talking about, which is that it led to the formation of a public sphere. Now, I will talk in great details about the public sphere in some time once I am able to introduce you more into the course. So, this printing era is also seen as giving rise to what political scientist and thinker Benedict Anderson would call of the imagined community. Now, what is this imagined community? Now, Anderson argues that the rise of the printing press actually gave rise to the idea of nationalism, which is shared belongingness to a particular geographical territory based on this idea of the imagined community. So, what he suggests is that before the growth of the newspapers and the fact that people are now reading the newspaper in every corner of the world and they can get global news at the tip of your fingers, it means that they share an imagination of belonging to a particular political national consciousness. For instance, if you are an Indian and India is a huge country, it is the 7th largest country in the world. You live in different regions of the world and in India, but you get to know about what is happening in the rest of the country. It is primarily through the news. Now, you will be thinking that I am getting this news from many sources, but at one point of time it was the newspaper which was the primary source. So, that meant that the people who were living in these diverse areas were able to read the same news and connect at a human level with each other. So, it meant that they created this imagined community. So, the idea of the communication and the communicative sphere in this era is rooted in also creating that sense of the imagined community. So, Benedict Anderson actually calls it print capitalism, primarily because the printing press and the method of printing led to the rise of the capitalist tendency of reproduction of news and news material, and this era also saw the entry of technological forces which further enhanced the capitalist way of living. So, as you can see, there is already a shift in communication from early communicative modes to the print era, and then we have industrial media, which is that mass production of newspapers. So, what Anderson suggests is reflected in the workings of the industry, in which you see news being replicated and carried over to almost all corners of the world. So, this period is also marked by telegraph and communication speed and the expansion of the information networks. So, when I went to school, we were actually taught an exercise in our English classes how to write a telegram, and these telegraphs would be the most important source of communication in the early independence era as well as in the beginning of the independence era, primarily because it was available to people who could sort of afford it. The telegraph is a very short message that you send, generally only 25 words or so, and that is supposed to communicate urgent messages. So, the way that we have communication today, in which we are able to keep up with daily conversations, letting our family members and friends know where we are, what we are doing, that did not exist some time back, because communication by itself was governed through the technology which did not have the kind of mass presence as it does today. So, when now we are thinking about the expansion of the information networks in the industrial media, this is also the era in which one saw communication becoming more mass oriented and democratic, right. More and more there is possibility of more people communicating with each other. Then comes the broadcast era, in which one can see the emergence of the radio as a mode of communication, which enabled particularly state personnel to communicate with the audience. Interestingly, in the broadcast era, the radio becomes a tool of spreading what people want to sort of communicate with their audience in multiple ways. Let us take an example. For instance, the head of the Commonwealth, in most cases Queen Elizabeth before her death, used to communicate with the Commonwealth countries through these radio broadcasts, especially on particular occasions, just so that everybody in the Commonwealth were aware that her presence was still there, and it was an effective medium to carry forward your message. The radio also becomes a way in which the governments across the world have promoted their social welfare schemes, as well as what they feel is important and has been done. The radio has had segments on education, on agriculture, which was also seen as important for citizens. So, communication in the broadcast era takes on a more non-interpersonal kind of engagement, where there is a mass audience that is envisaged. What we also have in this context is the dominance of the television. So, the entry of the television was able to change many ideas of how communication existed before. Now, this is a separate unit that we will be doing in great detail as we progress through the course, but very briefly let me illustrate how the television also in the Indian context underwent certain changes. So, the first emergence of the television was connected to the state, because the state was the main agency and we had state run channels like Doordarshan, through which the messages that the state thought were important were conveyed. In the second phase, we have had private broadcasters and players who then changed the game of the television industry itself, because you see that communication is now no longer about the state, it is about also private players and how they envisage the way that communication needs to be made. We will talk more about the television industry and what it means in the era of communication and media later in the course. This period also sees state control and mass audiences. Now, this is something which has been revolutionary, primarily because when we think about the newspapers are also seen as a medium which is more elitist and more privileged, because it is about the written word, and therefore, the television is able to even democratize a communication from the printing press or that era. Now, when we are thinking about these developments, what we are looking at is this relationship between the media and society, right. So, when we are thinking about this relationship between media and society, we have to also look at how it shapes public opinion, primarily through the development of the public sphere. So, what does this public sphere mean is that it allows for free and open communication between members of the public, and this is also a concept that we will discuss in greater length as we progress towards the course. This relationship between media and society is also shaped by questions of ideology and representation. So, what we should remember is that the media itself is a social institution. It is rooted in how communication is designed to be socially interactive, and what is represented in the media are ideological questions which are very much connected to how the state and the citizenship relationship is also formed. So, in one of the units we will go into these questions of how identities and questions of representation are framed in the media. The media is also a very significant tool of power, which is why who governs the media, who takes the decisions about what should be shown, how should the media be funded, should it be nationalized or should there be private players, these are all very important questions when we think about media and society. Interestingly, this is the era that we are in. And this is the era that most of you will be familiar with, which is this era of the digital media. The digital media era is connected to how the technological revolution of the 1980s took place and led to also a subsequent internet revolution. Now, this does not mean that the internet did not exist before or that it was not in usage. What it means is that it is this period in which there was a revolution, which means that the internet became a more mass product, right. Now, in this particular context, perhaps it is easier for all of you to understand how we have multiple social media platforms which thrive on user generated content. What this means is that you have the possibility of being content creators as well as consumers on the very same media platform, right. The digital media era, and there is a separate module on this as well in this course, as I have outlined in the introductory video. We will be talking about various forms of digital media. the nuances of the construction of this digital media and how it facilitates this relationship between cross borders. So, it is not to say that globalization as a process has not existed before digital media era began. Globalization has also always existed much before the 1990s as well, just that the intensity and frequency of global forces and how we understand globalization increased after the 1990s. Now, when we think about globalization and media, this particular relationship is also shaped by cultural exchange and questions of homogenization. What is homogenization in this context meaning? It means that when we are thinking about the model of media that we have today, it is very similar to the Western media. So, when for instance, the television came to India, it was something which was tried to be molded in the Indian context, and when we discuss it, I will explain in greater details with examples. But eventually what has happened is that the media model that we have today is homogenized in a way where it is reflecting the Western model. We also have the rise of media conglomerates, which means that big business media groups which hold a lot of stakes in terms of what kind of content are produced, etc. These media conglomerate also run media schools, and many people who study in the media schools then go on to also contribute to these media businesses and media content creation. What one can see is that the relationship between media and society no longer is only about communication. It is about communication, but also governed by ideas of cultural exchange, homogenization, universalization, as well as something which has entered the domain, which is profit making, right? In the way that how do broadcasters, channels and content creators in all the communicative spaces think about generating money. So, this course is a contemporary course rooted in the idea of the ever pervasive presence of media and communication, and therefore, in the first lecture I want to sort of leave you with a few discussion points about what contemporary issues could we think about. So, one of the most popularly known problems of recent times is fake news and misinformation, which continue to exist and has harmful kind of impacts on several key indicators of our lives. Especially health, where we have seen the impact of fake news and misinformation on how people take their health care and advice from people who may not be licensed or able to give that advice. Similarly, algorithmic control in an era which is called the platform economy or platform society, where one finds that algorithms control the kind of content that we are consuming. So, we also need to make an attempt to understand what algorithmic control is. The other issue that is also very significant is that of digital divide. Digital divide primarily because we still have unequal access as well as barriers in how marginalized sections of the country and the world at large continue to access or not access the internet. So, how can we think about communication and media without thinking about the digital divide? So, to conclude the first lecture of this course on sociology of media and communication, let me wind up by saying how the evolution of media reflects the kind of social change that we see in society, and this social change is also rooted in the change in communication, that we see that communication itself has undergone tremendous changes with the evolution of different forms of media. In the future, what we have is a world which is governed by artificial intelligence, immersive media, and today both you and me are consuming a lot of content around these issues on our phones and laptops, etc. So, we need to think about how communication will be shaped by these factors in the future. The last point that I want to emphasize is that because we live in a very significantly mediatized and digitized world, there is a need for critical engagement with these questions of how we continue to think about media and communication. So, the point of this introductory lecture and the introductory module is to set the foundation for this course on media and communication, and this lecture was about introducing you to different types of communication and the evolution through these technological interventions from the print to the broadcasting to the digital era. Thank you.